주의 하신 예수분 우바우치온 메리나 베스하토 라마로션 베스하토 라마로션 사손 베스하야 세구 사손 베스하야 세구
This is chickpeas, that's beautiful.
Oh, wow.
수야건 에라나파 사손 베스하야 세구 사손 베스하야 세구 사손 베스하야 세구 나수야건 에라나파 The ransom of God shall return. They shall come to Zion with song. Everlasting joy on their heads. Everlasting joy as their crown. The ransom
Ah, Jerusalem the Golden, the holy city, the city sacred to more people on the face of this earth than any other. For Jews, Christians and Muslims, this is indeed the holy city. Today, all eyes are irresistibly drawn to Jerusalem's most famous landmark, the Golden Dome of the Rock.
This is a truly unforgettable place, powerful, seductive and tragic. It's a site of perhaps unparalleled events in the history of the world. It's always been a site of conflicting claims.
Muslims believe that this was where Muhammad stopped on his celebrated nocturnal flight to heaven, while Jews consider that somewhere right here once stood their first two temples, the second of which was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Now all they have as the chief site for their prayers is the outer retaining wall of the temple's gigantic supporting platform. For Christians, the vast courtyards which now surround the Dome of the Rock are a reminder of how Jesus frequently taught here in the very precincts of the temple. Jerusalem is permeated with reminders of Jesus, his sufferings, death and resurrection, of which the garden tomb is a potent reminder. Today, its tranquil surroundings vividly recall the events of the very first Easter morning. It's not surprising that as Jerusalem invokes so many memories for Jews, Christians and Muslims, the whole world flocks to its crowded streets. Jerusalem is built as a city that is closely compacted together, wrote the psalmist 3,000 years ago. And the same is true of the old city today. Everyone jostles shoulder to shoulder in its narrow streets. Jews hurry on their way to excitements at the Great Plaza, in front of the famous Western Wall. Here they flock for celebration of Bar Mitzvah, the sacred rite shared by all young Jewish men on their 13th birthday. It's the day they put away childish things and step into the covenant between God and Israel. It's the day too when they commit themselves to the daily wearing of phylacteries, binding them on, as do their elders, in a very literal fulfillment of God's instruction. These commandments that I give you this day are to be upon your hearts. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. The blowing of the shofar is an announcement to all of the people of Israel that there's a new keeper of the commandments. The dancing certainly reminds one of King David dancing before the Lord, to the sound of trumpets and shofars, as he made his way to Jerusalem with the Ark of the Covenant. At the end of the celebrations, the precious Torah scrolls are lovingly returned to the Ark. This closet which holds them symbolises the Ark of the Covenant. The scrolls are kept here in the Ark, just as the original tablets of stone containing God's 10 Commandments were kept in the Ark of the Covenant. The curtain represents the Holy of Holies. It was around 3,000 years ago that King David marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived here. But they felt so secure in their lofty fortress that they hurled down insults on David in the valley below. "You'll never get in here," they scoffed. "Even the blind and lame could keep you out." But David did capture the fortress and called it the City of David. It was so small then in comparison with the great city of today. Ever since then, Jerusalem has exerted an extraordinary hold over the hearts and minds of Jews and later of Christians and Muslims around the world. The psalms the Jewish pilgrims sang as they journeyed to Jerusalem express the depth of the emotional attachment they felt towards the city. And it's still felt, even today. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem." Walk about Zion, go round about her, number her towers, consider well her ramparts, go through her citadels, that you may tell the next generation that this is God, our God, forever and ever. He will be our guide forever. Sadly, such confidence in God was not to be maintained, and the walls of Jerusalem have seen numerous foreign armies arrayed against them, as God allowed his chosen people to be conquered because of their lack of trust in him. The attack with the most far-reaching consequences was in AD 70, when the walls were again surrounded, this time by the might of Rome. The destruction this time was fearful indeed. The great boulders still lie where the Romans flung them down. 40 years earlier, Jesus had predicted exactly such an outcome. "Not one stone will be left standing," he said. "All will be thrown down." The walls have been rebuilt many times since then, but the bottom layers of the western wall here were deliberately left intact by the Romans as a final mockery to the Jews, who still grieve bitterly over the destruction of their temple. "Your servants hold Zion's stones dear," wrote the psalmist 3,000 years ago, and it's just as true today. So here they come to pray. For most Jews today, the wall is the major site of religious veneration in Jerusalem, a place of pilgrimage and worship. At any hour of day or night, you'll find them here, reading their scriptures, binding on their phylacteries, covering their heads. Some even with a prayer shawl. Extraordinary sights, an amazing mixture of complex emotions, and all seeking to win God's favour by these outward actions. They pray for the restoration of the temple, for the promised land, for the coming of the Messiah. Christians find these sights poignant, believing that the Messiah has come in the person of Jesus. But Jews will not share that belief. The death of Jesus on the cross is the big stumbling block. For them, Messiah is the conqueror of death, the giver of life. He cannot die. But Christians see it rather differently. Unless the Messiah meets death face to face, how can he conquer it? And so one site in the heart of today's city is of the greatest Christian significance. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with its two massive grey domes, stands over the site which has always been considered to be that of Jesus' death and resurrection. Not surprisingly, Christians from all around the world are irresistibly drawn here. For many, it's the dream of a lifetime to enter the very doors. The events which may have occurred right here are portrayed in this enormous mosaic. The body of Jesus is taken down from the cross. This is the most famous death in all history. There's the grief of Mary, of Peter, of Nicodemus, of the women as they watched the body of Jesus being wrapped in a linen shroud. And finally, the anguished farewell of the beloved disciple John as his body is placed in a rock-hewn tomb. The recollection of this awesome sacrifice for the sins of the whole world invoke the deepest emotions in Christians. They see Jesus was faithful to death. He never once gave in to Satan's temptations. So it is he who triumphs over the power of evil, and not vice versa, however improbable it may seem. So as Satan had no power over him in his life, how can he have any power over him in his death? Christians see his resurrection as the climax of the whole drama, the final miraculous piece that makes sense of all the rest. Sadly, the building, which should be radiating light and joy over such a stupendous victory, is dark and depressing. Beneath the mighty dome, the tomb is now encased in this vast and forbidding marble structure. So it's not surprising that with the increase in travel in the 19th century, people began to wonder whether there might be some other site waiting to be discovered, perhaps itself the true location of these momentous events. A place as evocative as the Garden of Gethsemane, for instance, where Jesus wrestled in prayer before his arrest. The tortured and grotesque forms of its ancient olive trees still recall his agony as he recoiled in horror at the prospect of bearing God's judgment on the sins of the whole world. It's a deeply moving place. So could there be a similarly evocative site for his crucifixion? That was the question way back in the 1840s. And it wasn't long before this rocky escarpment began to attract people's attention. It was reputed to have been a traditional place of stoning, which suggests that this had been an execution site at the time of Jesus. What's more, its curious skull-like formation was a chilling reminder that Jesus was crucified at a place known as Golgotha, the place of a skull. Even today, it's still a place of death, with a Muslim graveyard at the top of the hill. It was General Gordon who, in 1883, was the most famous of a growing number of people who considered this to be the true site of the crucifixion. That year he stayed in a house near the walls, which overlooked the site, with only the area now occupied by a bus station in between. The more he pondered the site, the more convinced he became. So if this really is the site of the crucifixion, then, according to the clear biblical description, the actual tomb can't be very far away from this, the place of a skull. And so the search was on. Somewhere right around here must lie the tomb, possibly hewn out of this very escarpment. But was there a tomb of the period to be found here? And if so, would it fit the biblical description? Actually, an ancient tomb had been discovered 16 years earlier in 1867. It had had to be excavated from beneath the rubble and debris of the centuries. It was only now that its existence assumed dramatic new significance. could this really be the tomb in which the body of Jesus had been laid? The tomb is now known as the Garden Tomb, and both the tomb itself and the garden which has been planted around it are lovingly tended by the custodians of the Garden Tomb Association. The garden itself is significant because the Bible says, "Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb." But was this a cultivated area 2,000 years ago? This ancient winepress suggests that the area may well have included a vineyard, and there'd certainly have been no shortage of water. This massive cistern is the third largest discovered in Jerusalem. The previous owners of this site must certainly have been wealthy. So was Joseph of Arimathea one of them, the man who offered his tomb as the burial place for Jesus? According to Matthew's Gospel, Joseph was a rich man himself.
There's no doubt that it's here, at the Garden Tomb, that we can really begin to visualise the events of that momentous morning. It all fits so perfectly with the vivid description in the Bible. There's a skull hill, a cultivated area, and an appropriate tomb, all just outside the wall of Jesus' day. So it was into Joseph of Arimathea's garden, in the early light of dawn, that the women were to make their way on that stupendous morning.
Who will roll the stone away, they'd wondered. But it had already gone. The tomb was empty. Mary Magdalene immediately fled back to Peter and John. "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they've put him." The other women appear to have lingered longer. The grave clothes were still intact, but the body of Jesus was gone. Suddenly, the dazzling light of two angels. "Why are you looking for the living in the place of the dead? He's not here. He's risen, as he said." Shortly afterwards, Mary Magdalene was to return, and possibly right here, or outside such a tomb as this, Jesus himself was to appear to her. The Lord of life, the conqueror of death, declared with power to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead, as the Apostle Paul was later to describe it. The garden is a little haven of peace amid the noise and bustle of the city. Outside its protecting walls, the contrast is great. Jerusalem remains a place of lurking tension and strife. The scars of previous conflicts can still be seen, a reminder of the tribulations of its 4,000-year history. The city's been more battled over, besieged, destroyed, and reconstructed than any other. It's as though here is the world's soul, where all its bitterest conflicts and most searching dilemmas must be worked out. Today, Israeli troops stand where Roman ones stood, seeking to preserve the peace in its crowded streets. The land's still torn by tension today, scarred by this great dividing wall, an attempt to separate the hostile communities. So watchtowers, checkpoints, and then there are the dead, in their serried ranks, tens of thousands of them. The Mount of Olives is littered with their graves. Is the city to see no glimmer of hope of rescue from this vicious spiral of hatred, war and death? Do the countless graves merely reinforce the sense of pointlessness and hopelessness of human life? Is the prayer for the peace of Jerusalem ever to be fulfilled? It's back in this peaceful garden that one tomb alone points to an answer. This is a place for Christians to ponder the significance of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, which lies at the very heart of their faith. The resurrection confirms Jesus' claim to be the Son of God, that his sacrifice for the sins of the whole world has been accepted, and that consequently the gate to eternal life is now open for all who believe. It's little wonder then that here, in this place of great peace, Christians of all traditions take the bread and wine, as Jesus commanded, to remember his awesome sacrifice and its triumphant vindication.
For the forgiveness of sins, do this as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me. Amen.
The beauty of the surroundings recall the beauty of his promise, that where he is, those who love him may be also. Now ascended and seated at the right hand of his Father in heaven, Christians believe that he waits to welcome all those who put their faith and trust in him. It's often said that one of the most vivid and lasting memories that people bring back from their times here in Jerusalem is that of their visit to the Garden Tomb.